Alrighty, David, we are back. Another episode of the Data Dive. Episode 4, I think this is. And I guess that's sponsored by collared shirts because we both wore one today. So how are you doing, man? Thanks for joining me again.
And the month flew by, huh?
To me, it's summer's over. It's like, I feel by the time now summer barely started. By the time this comes out, it'll probably be early June, and we're getting there. So yeah, it's flying by. So and that,
Like we had 3 warm weeks of weather. The first week, my car broke down. Second week, I got a sunburn. And the third week, well, I guess we'll find out, won't we?
yeah, I got a chip in my windshield on the drive to work today. So that's
Cracked my windshield last week. Not a great year so far.
oh, we'll get there. Yeah, so based on the most recent report there, we are getting a lot closer to, I guess, what you like to call the summer leasing season. You always make sure that when I chat with people in the media, that I chat about seasonality of just the rental market in Canada. This might be a good time just kind of go over what is the summer leasing season and how do you see it affect the rental market?
So the summer leasing season is really just a way of explaining what the trends are, the annual trends in rental demand, right? So each year, along with the winter, or along, I should say, with the weather, we see changes in leasing demand. In the coldest months of the year, we see very little demand. During the warmest months of the year, the summer, we typically see demand rise pretty substantially. So it really is just we see this nice curve every single year. And when I say every year, I'm really referring to that long term average, the trends that we see on a recurring annual basis. Typically, sometime in April, we'll start to see stronger increases in rental demand. We'll see more people online, more people searching for apartments, more people submitting leads for apartments. That'll continue to trend upwards into the summer, peaking in July or August. Really, again, depends on the market. Some communities we see that they're slightly earlier. Some markets come in a little later, but as a whole, July, August, in September, that's when we start to see the decline. We see that rental demand just drops off a cliff, and that's a normal part of the annual trend.
A lot of students,
That'll
right? A lot of students demand.
well, the student demand really comes in a little bit earlier in the year. That picks up sometime around February, March. But in September, there is a bit of a blip just before school start. But as a whole, really, just we see fewer and fewer people on market. That continues on through October, November, December. December is typically the slowest month, right? We have the holidays. It's a cold. It gets very cold, and we see fewer people on market. Obviously, nobody wants to move in December either. In January, with people returning from vacation, returning from home, returning from time off, we see that there's always a bit of a blip, right? So we see a little momentary rise. February, we continue to see just a flattening or a slowing, and then we come back to that trend again, where we see a rising action, a peak, falling action, and that happens year and year and year again. That being said, the last 2 years haven't really been par for the course. We've seen much slower rental demand in 2024, and so far, it seems like we're seeing very much of the same in 2025.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Like, what are you seeing with leasing volumes? What are you seeing in activity on our site? Are they kind of reflective of, I guess I would say, typical seasonal trends, which means trends that we had, before 2 years ago when we were seeing a lot more seasonality? Or, what kind of volumes are we seeing right now? And are they typical to the spring and summer?
Yeah, so, early on in the year, and I mean, January, February, March, things were looking quite hopeful. We were seeing above average, and when I say average, I mean relative to last year or the year before that, we were seeing above average rebounding. So strong month over month changes, uh, which lends to positive long term growth. It lends to a hopeful outlook and a potential for a resurgence to conventional rental demand trends. However, as of April, that trend has seemed to have slowed down. We're actually now slowing down again, relatively. We're still higher than we were anytime during the winter. We're still higher than we were in October, September, but we aren't quite at the same levels that we would expect to be at. Certainly not with the month over month trends if we were to see a really strong resurgence coming forward. That being said, I've said this before and I'll say it again. At least this is my personal opinion. The rental market is a consumer market. I think we've talked about this, and I tried to explain my rationale to you before, but just like any consumer market, there is supply and demand. The supply is apartments, and the demand is reflective of renters on market. When when there is insecurity in the outlook of the economy, when people don't have job security, when people are just uncertain about the future, they shop less. With this in the same, is reflective on the rental market side. When people are uncertain, when they lack security, when they don't really know where the future is going to take them, they move less. And that's what we're seeing right now. So I don't have a crystal ball. I can't just tell you the future as much as I would love the future outlooks of our beautiful country to be really positive and to show strong growth. That hasn't really been, what's that's not what's being written down. It's not what's being discussed, and certainly doesn't seem like what is on the precipice for us. And people are reacting to that. They're responding to that by just submitting fewer leads, because what's the value in moving if you're not really sure where that's going to take you? Right? You move when there's a positive outlook. People like to move a lot when they're moving for jobs. They like to move for new opportunities. But if you don't see an opportunity, you're less likely to move.
Yeah, and I'm curious of what you took from the most recent rent report because rents across the country are down just shy of 3%, but we did see for 2 consecutive months now rents have actually increased. That's been February to March, March to April. Not by much, but we are starting to see about I believe it was 0.4% of a month over month increase across the country. What do you take from that? Is that kind of expected? Is it a blip? Is it a trend? Is it seasonality? What do you think by that?
Yeah, whether it's a trend or is again, I think that we'll learn more about that in the coming months if that trend continues onwards. I think very much it is a response to what properties believe that they can achieve. Okay, and when we delve into that and we look at individual property types, when we look at individual markets, we see that trend kind of splits. Right, different property types are moving in different directions, and I think that what's happening right now is that the market is simply converging. So as a whole, we see property types moving closer together. Right, 10 years ago, apartments and condos would have seen a substantial difference, a delta, I should say, in what their achievable rents would have been. But now that gap is slowly shrinking out.
Mhm.
Obviously, part of that is going to be due to higher quality apartments. Last month, we talked about quite a few of these, high end new rental developments that, again, 10, 15 years ago, unheard of completely. Right.
Yeah.
Well, as they come to market, obviously, they're pushing the envelope, and that allows them to achieve rents more in line with what you would expect in the secondary market. And I think that's really what's happening. Long term, rents will likely to continue to grow. Certainly from the fact that we're just not building as much again. In some communities, I was reading a comment on Twitter, and I think this may have been in Laval, and he said this commenter said, "Around me, there are 9 cranes. All of them are building rentals." Well, that's great. You know what? On my drive into work, I see just about 6 or 7 cranes,
Same.
and of those, 2 condos, the rest are rentals. Great. Unfortunately, we're not breaking ground with new projects. That means that all the projects that we have ongoing right now are the only ones that we're going to see likely in the next 4 to 5 years. Because if it's not already being breaking ground, it's not going to get started anytime soon. And if it's in pre-development or in planning or approvals, that could still be 3, 4, 5 years away from ever actually seeing the light of day. On top of that, with the cost of construction being as high as it is, with the cost of capital being higher, it makes these deals it makes them harder to pencil in, I should say. And then there are other considerations, right, that can potentially limit new projects coming to market, right? Um, Even though rents are as high as they are, we're seeing fewer and fewer people that are actually willing to pay these rents.
Yeah.
Okay. So bringing a new project to market that will require you to charge like top of market rents or very close to is more difficult to rationalize now if you think, well, there is a population of renters that with strong enough incomes, because we know average renter incomes have increased over the last 5 years. But a lot of these people are already renting. So convincing them to move somewhere else to pay more in rent is a tougher call. Certainly, when again future prospects or outlook isn't necessarily the most positive. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to be just a very negative discussion.
No, no, not at all. We'll add some positive touches to this, but we're just is telling it as it is, right? Um, was it? I think Sean from Urbanation says about 100 months from for first build rental to actually get completed in Toronto. From hey, let's do this to when it's done. It's years and years. So on the same thing, we see tons of cranes when we drive into work, but those projects were started or,
5 years ago.
and 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? Um, it's interesting that there seems to be a market that is kind of bucking this trend a little bit. We're seeing Halifax, which has kind of experienced some extraordinary year-over-year increases, which is contrary to most of Canada's major cities. You got any takes on, Eastern Canada, Halifax specifically? Why does that seem to be the one that's kind of been the outlier?
It's not just Halifax. It's I mean, we're seeing this in a lot of the more traditionally more affordable communities. Halifax itself is, uh, well, I should say, benefits from a lot of the it benefits from its location. It benefits from the culture. It benefits from the fact that it was traditionally considered more affordable. And that certainly worsened over the last few years. Affordability has decreased as new projects come to market.
Mhm.
There was a massive wave of immigration or movement, population influx, I should say, into Halifax. That again created a substantial amount of rental demand, which drove up apartment prices pretty substantially. And in Halifax, certainly up until 2018, 2019, there really wasn't a lot of new construction. Here and there, there were a few organizations that were building, but for the most part, there really wasn't. And it was going to be a lot of student focused properties. There was a lot of older converted properties. And that doesn't result in, or that doesn't lend very well to a growing metropolitan
Mm.
market, right? There was a lot of international demand, a lot of in migration or inter-provincial migration, I should say. And we're seeing a lot of that in other provinces now. Okay. If you look at the most recent report, I mean, you can probably quote this better than I can, but what are some of the fastest growing municipalities? They're going to be Saskatoon. That's,
Yeah.
I think, number one, maybe Lloydminster, Regina. The most affordable communities nationally are the ones that are growing. Um, I know the GTA the best, maybe southeastern and southwestern Ontario. It's where I spent most of my time, most of my life growing up, certainly. And I can tell you that even within southwestern and southeastern Ontario, the markets that are growing the fastest as of right now, and I'm not just talking about rents, but also in regards to rental demand, because even though we are seeing generally rental demand is on the decline, there are still markets that are showing exactly.
Gotcha.
These are going to be the markets that offer, and I've said this before. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but these are markets that offer strong accessibility, strong employment opportunities uh, within the community. Okay, I'm not talking about like Vaughan, where you can live in Vaughan, you can work in the city, you can live in Vaughan, work in Mark, whatever. I'm talking about municipalities that offer proximate employment opportunities, strong levels of amenitization, and ultimately just offer a benefit to those that want to live in them.
Mm.
Right? Kitchener Waterloo, great example. Guelph, great example. If we move out a little bit east, we start to see again some other smaller communities that are seeing a relative bucking of the trend, because again they offer specifically young families a lot of the benefits that they were looking for, while also offering a greater relative rate of affordability.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be an interesting one to see because interprovincial migration was such a story for so long, specifically like people moving to Alberta from Ontario and British Columbia. There was interprovincial migration going out east. There was some were going to Quebec. Curious to see how that will continue. Like, I'm assuming interprovincial migration will probably start to slow down throughout the rest of 2025. Um, and I think as well, because you mentioned, you know, demand is down. We're not seeing a lot of new renters coming to the market. But I'm curious to see what will happen with people who are currently in place renters who now are starting to see, hey, market rents have been going down 10, 15, 20% in the last couple of years. Maybe it's time to actually move out of my current rental and go to a new place that's offering a lot of movement incentives. As you mentioned, a lot of these new apartment buildings have amenities that were unheard of 15 years ago. Just kind of curious to see what will happen with in-place renters. If we're going to start seeing a movement of, hey, this building a couple kilometers away is offering me a lot more amenities, and it's about the same price now because rents have been going down. No,
And what you're describing is a highly mobile market. We really don't see that. There are communities though that are like that. A great example. I might be working off of outdated information. Certainly, I haven't been dealing with. Um, I haven't spoken to organizations that are doing active lease-ups in Winnipeg in the last maybe year or two, but certainly 3 years ago, there were new properties coming to market in Winnipeg that were experiencing the difficulty of leasing up and maintaining that level of
yeah,
lease up. Because what happens is the term professional renter, when we use that typically that means someone who knows how to game the system. But over there, they had professional renters that knew how to game the system in a different way. Every year you move somewhere else because you get an incentive. And if you keep a relatively small house, it's not that hard to move on a yearly basis. You save good money, you maintain a lower achievable rent.
yeah.
It's certainly a lot of work, and I wouldn't want to put that much work into, having to uproot my entire life every single year. But if it means you save a couple months of rent, for some people the math pencils out, right? I don't expect that to happen here. Certainly even with the rise of incentives and promotions. That being said, um, the existing population of in-place renters, if we start to see an increase in their mobility, that's going to be huge, and that's going to lend to a substantial amount of, again, new product and market, but also overall rental demand increasing. One of the big factors in rental demand having declined so dramatically this year, last year, was the fact that we've been seeing fewer, well, maybe some more so this year, but we've been seeing fewer international entrants, right? There are a few people coming into the country, and as we know, new entrants into the country are substantially more likely to rent,
Right.
certainly for the first 2 years. And with fewer people coming into the market, there's just less people on the market looking for rentals. On top of that, with fewer people wanting to move for fear of increasing the cost of living for themselves, we're seeing turnover rates go dramatically down. Okay, turnover rates are a sign of a healthy market, and it's a sign of a market that turns. Right,
Yeah, for sure.
means people are moving around, people are upgrading, they're moving to different communities, they're moving for
Ab-
opportunities,
Yeah.
buying homes exactly. But with low turnover rates, it means people are staying in place longer, so units are being taken out of the market for longer. And from the perspective of a property manager, property owner, um, if you have units that are staying off market for longer, the costs of operations don't exactly stay the same,
No.
right? Means that fewer units come to market, and that when those units come to market, you may very well have to charge more for them in order to make up for the loss.
I'm curious your take on it too, though, Dave, because it seems like, in a way, this is kind of what they wanted. They, as in the government, they wanted demand to go down because supply couldn't catch up, right? That's why they really decreased the amount of international population growth. They tried to increase the amount of supply by giving incentives like removing the HST for personal rentals for on developers. Are you saying you think they've gone too far? Like, I'm curious how you're thinking because if you go on a time machine a couple years ago, would say demand is too high for the supply that we have. So now demand is decreasing. Has it gone too far, or is it
You
moving
sound like
towards
a
balance?
conspiracy theorist at this point. There's a saying, "Don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to incompetence."
Yeah.
And although it doesn't directly apply here, I don't necessarily know if they had this intention in mind when they were trying to instigate their relative market controls. Uh, I certainly thought that bringing some of these changes to taxation would have a positive outcome, but I did say when they came out, whether it's too little, too late, or whether it's just not enough, either one can apply, but it's not really going to change very much. Certainly not in the short term, maybe in the long term. 5, 10 years from now, we'll see more projects. But again, with how long it takes to bring a project to market, telling people now, oh, yeah, you bring a project to market, no HST. fantastic. Give me 5 years, let me do all the planning, let me get my approvals, and we can talk then. Um, and even then, HST is one part of it. It still doesn't pencil out the fact that I nobody want people don't renters, I should say, don't want to pay the rents that I would have to charge in order to cover the cost of construction, right?
Bingo.
Um, so there is a bit of a challenge there. I think that ultimately, again, I think that really the best way to put it is it's too little, too late, right? It was a really positive and set in it was a good thought. It was in the right place, but unfortunately, it came 2 years too late.
Yeah, and then I'm not sure what's next because, you know, we see the estimates that CMHC puts for the amount of homes and units that we need. Those were obviously unachievable. We were never built.
Keep in mind, sorry for cutting you off there, but keep in mind those numbers that they put out are the extra number that we would need in addition to what's already being built, right? So whatever they know is going to be built, we need an additional, what is it, 1.1.5 million roughly, in addition to what they already know is built and what they project is likely to be built.
Right. Which was obviously something that I think is 3 or 4 times the historic building rate Canada's ever seen, which probably isn't gonna happen, but then we have to lower demand, but now demand has really come down, so it's an interesting spot we're in, but I do think what they can do is the units that they do bring into the market, like, are they smart in what they're bringing in, right? Do you think that we're gonna start seeing the types of units change a little bit? We know studio apartments have high demand because 'cause they're just the cheapest option. But as you mentioned, people have more money now who are renters, which means they probably have more money to spend and want more things. So they probably want more space. Do you think we're going to start seeing more bigger units built?
I think that there's a I think that there's a misalignment of incentive and a misalignment of need here. The renters that the more affluent renters that are still renting, are not going to take very kindly to the types of units that the government wants to bring to market right now. Okay. Now, I'm not sure if you're referring to like the government housing that the current Liberal Party wants to bring to market, or if you're talking about what like private market developers would bring to market based
I,
on the current market
I
conditions.
guess both. I was leaning more towards like market developers, but I guess you can loop them all together for sure.
So the government, the federal government wants to bring, whether you want to call it workforce housing, modular homes, pre-built homes, what have you. These are not going to be of the same size, quality, characteristics as what a more affluent renter is going to expect.
Yeah.
You if you once you've you get to a point in your life, you expect a certain quality of life, and I don't expect that these homes are going to achieve to offer that. No, it's still early. I stand to be corrected, and I'd be more than happy to be wrong about this, but I don't expect them to align in that sense. Renters, certainly those that that expect a certain quality or standard of life, are going to remain in place, and they're going to look elsewhere for their homes. Um, my family's from Eastern Europe, and honestly, long term, I don't expect this to end very well. I'll keep my personal politics out of this, though. What I can tell you is that there is another concern of mine, which I'm more than happy to talk about, which is a degradation of the standard of living. Uh, I don't think we talk about this nearly enough, but there are rules in Canada that relate to what the minimum requirements are for a certain standard of living, right?
Mhm.
Municipalities have building codes. We have requirements for the size of a unit, this whether we have requirements for, egress, we have requirements for fire code, we have requirements for exterior, lighting and all that. And I worry that in a bid to try to bring more affordable housing to market, we devalue that,
Something's got
right?
to give, right?
Something's got to give, exactly, right? Whether it's the quality of the housing or it's the quality of life that it offers, something has to bend to the will.
Yeah.
And I very much worry about the long term implications if we start to build smaller and smaller and smaller units. I'm sure we've all seen those documentaries of those rooming houses in like Hong Kong. You've got 10 by 10 or maybe 5 by 8, and your entire life is contained within it. Obviously, that's an extreme example, right? But I worry about the quality of life declining long term if we start to try to, we kind of start going down this road.
No, it's a valid concern, and I think kind of ties how I wanted to end this with shared accommodations because we saw that for the provinces that we do track it, we are seeing decreases in the cost of shared accommodation listings. Um, I do think that is going to continue to be a high priority simply because obviously there's a ton of benefits in there. But why do you think shared accommodation listing prices have also gone down? Because in my mind, shared accommodation listings are the ones that are almost always going to increase because the demand for roommates with the prices of rents that we're seeing is always going to remain high. But it didn't seem to be the case. There were some decreases from, especially in a lot of these major cities, right? So, do you think that we're going to start seeing roommate rentals change? Do you think we need more roommate rentals? Do you think because of that 2 to 3 bedroom units are needed a lot more because we still are seeing a lot of leads being submitted for roommates? How do we see that come into play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first and foremost, I see that the reason behind why shared accommodations are continuing to decline is really a factor of one, the time of the year. Okay, um, shared accommodations aren't really in as much demand right at this moment. They will increase in popularity, I believe, over the course of the summer. Okay. That being said, I see that there's a delay here between the decline in shared accommodations and the decline in the overall market, right? Because ultimately, shared accommodation rents are going to be based or determined on how much the unit actually charges,
Right.
right? So if you moved in a year ago, or you moved in 6 months ago, and now you're looking for a roommate, um, that rent is going to potentially be based off of what you were charging or what you were charged initially, or potentially might even take a bit of a haircut on it. That's unlikely, but the option's always there. But long term, we are seeing that market rents are declining. When I look at the per bed cost of entire units, right? So we look at one beds, two beds, divide by two because obviously there's two beds, assuming we have a roommate situation, three beds and three, assuming we have three different roommates. We see that the actual cost, the average cost of these shared accommodations falls roughly in line with what the values we would see if we actually took the rent and we'd have subdivided by the number of beds. Okay, they fall directly in line there. All right, obviously there's going to be a little bit of variation, some larger units, smaller units, better amenitized units, worse amenitized units, or more poorly amenitized, I should say. But what we see here is that let's say in Ontario, okay, you could expect anywhere from 1,300 to 800 or to $980 on average, okay, if you were gonna be living in either a two-bed or a three-bed unit, okay? That is anywhere from a 20 to a 40% reduction in rent
Mhm.
than if you were planning on living alone, okay, minimally, right? If we look, a living alone, it might cost you $2,000, but the moment you had a roommate, suddenly you're down $700. Had another roommate, now you're down another 3 or $400 potentially, okay? Um, on average, though, we see that going from a one bed to a roommate situation with a two bed, we see that, the delta is typically is on average about 39%, which is substantial, right?
Oh, for sure. Oh,
There's there's a reason why roommate situations are becoming more and more common. That's because, uh, living with a friend can save you substantially, right? Living with an extra friend will save you an additional 21%.
well, that's why I'm thinking 2 and 3 bedroom apartments are what we need to see built because there's going to be a need for these roommate rentals to continue. I don't think they're going to drop off a cliff. Like chances are, these new builds that are coming, are they going to be affordable for most people? Especially new renters. But
No, maybe not for a single family or for a couple, but it may very well be the case for, for three different young professionals living together. When I'd spoken about this previously, but a few years ago there was talk about 10% three bed units.
Mhm.
They called them, whether you want to call them inclusionary zone units, they called them family units. They said all new construction has to have 10% of its units as three beds, and that was because at the time nobody wanted to build three beds. Didn't make sense, right? Why would I do that? I can charge less rent per square foot for a three bed than I can for a two bed or even a one bed. I'd rather just build three extra one beds and I'll achieve substantially more. I mean, if we look at this, we can already see, right? You're saving what 70% per bed if as a three bed as opposed to living alone. And developers, the math obviously is a little bit different, but it is very much the same in the terms of that you can charge a higher per square foot value for a smaller suite. Okay. And there wasn't really, we assumed, well, nobody's going to want to live in these units. It doesn't really make sense. They're very large. The chunk rent is going to be too expensive. And initially, there was a bit of a lull, but eventually we saw, okay, the people are renting these units, not really leaving, and these are primarily roommates. Obviously there were some families. I remember going to a new building built around I want to say 2018, talking to some of the residents, and I asked them, like, how often do you see families? How often do you see kids? "No, I think there's maybe two in the building." Well, I know that there was substantially more three beds. Well, what about the rest of the three beds? So I asked someone who worked there. Oh yeah, roommates.
Roommates.
There we go.
Yeah, I get it, and that's why I wanna make sure that it's not just bringing new units to market, it's bringing new units that what people want, right? And I think that is because the unachievable dream of the 1.1 million units probably isn't gonna happen, but the units that we do bring into the market are the ones that we're seeing, at least on Rentals.ca, is in high demand because I think that's the only way that we actually are gonna restore some sort of sense of affordability is if we're offering people what they actually can afford.
It doesn't work for everybody, right? I acknowledge not 3 bed is not conducive to every single person's living situation, but it can certainly resolve a lot of the concerns, and it can certainly alleviate some of the demand for some segments of the market, I should say,
Well, especially
right?
if you work from home. Like, if you work from home, you
Yeah.
probably want a home office, you don't wanna work in your bedroom, right? So even if you just want a couple with 1 kid, they might want an extra room just for a home office, right? Like, people are the makeup of what a renter is a little bit different now. They're not necessarily living in downtown cores, but they're probably working from home, and they probably would like a space for home office, right? So, we'll see. It's gonna be interesting what happens the next couple of years. So, I think, David, we put on our collared shirts. We both had our windshields cracked, but we were able to make it. Appreciate your time as always. We will have this up on our YouTube page shortly. So please leave a comment, subscribe if you're interested, and we'll talk to you guys soon. David, thanks so much, buddy. Appreciate it.
There.
You take care.